In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements is concluded. The Prime Minister on indulgence.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment will be absent from the House this week as he is in the United States conducting trade talks. The Minister for Foreign Affairs will answer questions on his behalf.
I thank the Prime Minister. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My questions to the Prime Minister. Under this Liberal government, wholesale electricity prices have doubled, pollution is up, and jobs in renewable energy are down. So will the government—
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Minister for Energy and Environment on cue is now warned. I can't hear the Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition will begin his question again.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Under this Liberal government, wholesale electricity prices have doubled, pollution is up, jobs in renewable energy are down. So will the government commit to working with Labor through the Finkel report to address this massive policy failure?
The Prime Minister has the call. Members on my right. Well, the members for Wright and McKellar will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question, Mr Speaker. The honourable member's party has more than anyone contributed to the rise in electricity prices across Australia. The Labor Party's recklessness is consistent across every level of government. We have seen the extraordinary state of affairs in South Australia, the home state of the Shadow Energy Minister, where without any regard for planning, for storage, for backup, without any regard to economics or engineering, but with every regard for ideology and politics, the Labor government allowed the state to have nearly half of its generation capacity come from wind, capable of generating all of the state's electricity one minute and none the next. And the consequence has been the least reliable and the most expensive electricity in Australia. Mr Speaker, my government is setting out one step after another to ensure that we deliver secure and reliable and affordable electricity. What is Labor's plan? Unrealistic targets, 50% reductions in emissions, twice— oh, they're cheering. They chair that, Mr Speaker. They have no idea of how
Members
to get
on
there,
my left. The member
no
for Griffith.
idea of how to pay for it, no idea of how to design it. The Labor Party left the engineering and the economics at the door and attacked Australia's energy system armed with only politics and partisanship. They have no plan at all. Now, the honourable member asked the honourable member asked about gas prices. Mr Speaker, since I announced our plan, our determination, our commitment to limit exports from the East Coast until domestic supply was assured, since I announced that policy, that commitment, we have seen a fall in wholesale gas prices on the East Coast. We have already arrested the rapid rise in prices on the East Coast, which were being driven by a shortage of supply, taking a tough decision, quickly responding to the problem. Now, but what's the long-term answer? What's the long-term answer? It's more gas. It's more gas. Who stands in the way of more gas? The Labor government of Victoria, and none more so. Masses of gas sitting on a huge amount of gas in Victoria, but refusing to do anything to exploit it. We have a plan founded on economics and engineering, ideology and politics. Labor's way have got us into the affairs we're in now.
The member for Hunter will cease interjecting. The member for Parramatta is now warned. And the member for Dunkley has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is strengthening our citizenship laws to enable Australia to remain a secure and harmonious nation?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the honourable member for his question. And, Mr Speaker, as I've often said and as we reflected today in the debate on national security, Australia is the most successful multicultural society in the world. And there is no more honoured title in our democracy than that of Australian citizen. Australian citizenship should be respected, honoured and valued. And it should be offered to those who respect our laws and institutions and share our values. Now, we are a remarkable country. Unlike many others, we define our national identity by reference to shared values, not by reference to ethnicity or religion or race. And they are shared political values: democracy, the rule of law, freedom, equality between men and women, mutual respect. These are fundamental political values that are available to all, and that is the key element in the success of our democracy. We are a beacon of harmony around the world in the midst of our own diversity. We must not take this for granted. Now, the Productivity Commission's report from 2016 showed that integration and English language skills are key ingredients for our success as a multicultural society and indeed our safety. So strengthening those requirements is fundamentally important. Equally, I would have thought all honourable members, but I fear, Mr Speaker, many on the other side of the House do not agree with this proposition, all honourable members would agree that those who seek to be Australian citizens should clearly demonstrate that they share our values and are integrating in our community. Australian citizenship should not be the end product of a clinical administrative process that does not seek to establish that a person who wants to be part of the Australian political family, one of our citizens, a citizen in our nation, shares our values. Now, Mr Speaker, I was very disappointed to see today that the member for Watson said that a strong position on citizenship, the reforms that we've described, have got nothing to do with national security. The member for Watson should understand, as well as anyone in this House, that the harmony in our society is based on shared values, a strong commitment to integration. Now, if he does not think that a strongly integrated society, one based on commitment and sharing the values that make us the nation we are, if he thinks that has got nothing to do with national security, then he totally misunderstands the nature of the threats we face. The Prime Minister's time
has concluded. The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Modelling in the Finkel report assumes no new coal-fired power stations will be built under a clean energy target. And the Chief Scientist has said about new coal-fired power stations, and I quote, "It would be surprising if governments were to endorse a scheme that incentivised them." Does the Prime Minister agree with the Chief Scientist?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Finkel report is a report to government or governments. It's a report to COAG. We thank Dr Finkel for his work and for the members of his panel who contributed to it. The honourable member should understand that what Dr Finkel proposes as a clean energy target does not penalise coal. It does not prohibit the construction of a coal-fired power station or indeed a gas-fired power station. What he seeks to do there is to provide incentives for lower emission technologies, including but not exclusively renewables. Now, the fundamental challenge that the honourable member opposite faces is that he hails from the state of South Australia. He comes from South Australia, and he comes from a state which has, with a complete failure of planning, resulted in the most expensive and the least secure electricity in Australia. He's done that. He comes from a state which has seen the closure of baseload power and with no storage, not a unit of storage or backup to put in its place. So the honourable members, fellow South Australians, know full well what happens when energy policy is driven by ideology and politics as opposed to engineering and economics. We face a real challenge in energy policy in this country. We are in a position where about to become the largest, I should say, exporter of LNG, and yet we've had a shortage of gas on the east coast of Australia. My government is taking the decisive action to address it. We face that challenge. What's caused it? Politics. State governments refusing to allow the exploration of gas and the development of gas resources.
Member for
We've seen in South Australia a complete failure to consider that variable sources of electricity, like wind and solar, need backup. They need storage. What did Labor do about it? Nothing. What are we doing about it? Snowy Hydro 2.0, the largest addition of storage in our history. At least we are, for the first time as an Australian government, recognising that we need to change the design of our energy system to give Australians the affordability, the security that they need and meet their emissions reduction targets. Labor's addiction to ideology and politics has brought us to the situation where prices are too high, energy is not reliable enough, and we are not achieving enough progress towards those emission reduction targets. We can solve this trilemma, but it needs planning, it needs engineering and economics, and that's what my government delivers, and that's where Labor has failed.
The member for North Sydney.
Speaker, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the Minister advise the House on how the government is putting Australia's national interests first on matters of foreign policy and international security? Is the Minister aware of any other approaches?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Other approaches?
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for North Sydney for his question on a very serious issue. Mr Speaker, Australia's national interest is best achieved by working with our allies and partners to defend and strengthen the rules-based order that has underpinned our national prosperity, security and stability for nigh on 7 decades. And a key to ensuring that our national interest is served is clarity and consistency in our foreign policy, because this preserves the government's integrity when it comes to policy making and decision making. So when the government is confronted by challenges such as the differing positions on the South China Sea, our government is able to point to a clear, consistent policy position. We enhance our relationships with all countries in the region, no matter what our disagreements are, and that is because this government has integrity when it comes to our foreign policy positions. Clarity, consistency and coherency. Unfortunately, Mr Speaker, the same cannot be said of all members of the Labor Party. In fact, we now know that Senator Dastyari's about-face on the South China Sea had a price tag attached to it.
The member for
Indeed,
Isaacs.
a reported $400,000 was all it took for Senator Dastyari to trash Labor's official foreign policy position. Now, Mr Speaker,
Members on
we
my
know
left.
the spectacle during the 2016 election, when Labor's then defence spokesman, Senator Conroy, stood at the National Press Club and outlined Labor's official foreign policy on freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, only to be publicly contradicted only hours later by the then Manager of Opposition Business in the Senate, Senator Sam Dastyari. Now, members will recall how Senator Dastyari
member
called
for
a press
Griffith is
conference
warned.
at the Commonwealth
The member for
Parliamentary
Solomon
offices in
is
Sydney,
warned.
and he stood there before the Australian flag, before a lectern with the Australian Commonwealth coat of arms, next to his Chinese benefactor, who also stood at a lectern with the Australian coat of arms, and he publicly contradicted Labor's official foreign policy for a reported $400,000. And what did the Leader of the Opposition do? In the face of the most extraordinary primary public admission of foreign interference and influence. He slapped him on the wrist, sent him to the backbench for a couple of months, and Senator Sam Dastyari is now back in a leadership position in the Labor Party. This Leader of the Opposition sold out our national interest.
The Foreign Minister's time has concluded. Members on both sides, the member for Griffith has been warned. The Leader of the House. The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Leader. To say to the Leader of the House, some people have lost their voice with the cold going round. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Chief Scientist has said about new coal-fired power stations, and I quote, "It would be surprising if governments were to endorse a scheme that incentivised them." I give the Prime Minister another opportunity. Does he agree?
The member for Barton. The Prime Minister has the call.
I can tell the honourable member precisely what the government's position is on energy policy, and that is this. Ours is based on economics and engineering. The honourable member's position is based on politics and ideology, and it has failed. It's failed Australia manifestly. It's failed Australian consumers. The reality is simply this. That the clean energy target proposed by Dr Finkel provides incentives, would provide an incentive to forms of generation that are lower than the benchmark of so many kilograms per tonne per megawatt hour. That is how it would work. That would benefit any generation, whether it is coal, whether it is gas, whether it is renewable, as long as it was below the benchmark. But it does not penalise forms of generation higher than that. So that's the simple fact. The honourable member can have whatever views he likes about the economics of the electricity industry, but the reality is this: the time for politics and ideology is over. Australians want solutions. They want a plan.
Member for
now,
Lindsay.
The honourable member can write me lovely letters. He likes writing me letters, Mr Speaker, and he's always so sanctimonious in his letters. This is good, Bill. This is the goody two-shoes, and he always appeals to bipartisanship. And he sends a letter round, and I'm sure he feels really good about it. You know, he writes that letter and he says, "Oh well." I think what he really says, Mr Speaker, he says, now I've got that bipartisanship off my chest, I'll get back to the old bill. And of course we get the same ideological
Prime Minister will refer to
attacks
members
we've
by
always
their
had.
correct titles.
What we've got is a challenge in our energy sector. Energy is too expensive, it's not reliable enough, and we need to have a plan to meet our emissions commitments, 26 to 28% from 2005 levels by 2030. Now that's our commitment. Labor wants, Mr Speaker, to do double that. They want to have 50% cut and remove 45%. I'm corrected, 45% by 2030. They have no plan for that. They weren't even aware, Mr Speaker. So dim-witted is this bunch of left-wing ideologues opposite. So dim-witted are they, so utterly untutored in anything to do with engineering or science. These fools, Mr Speaker, were happy to have lots of renewable energy, but it didn't occur to them that sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and they forgot to do anything about it. And the member for Port Adelaide, better than anyone, knows what that means.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. Members could just resume their seats for a second. The member for Chifley. Just going to say to members who I've asked to stop interjecting, many of which have been warned, I'll have no choice but to start ejecting them from now on. The level of noise is far too high. The member for McKellar is warned, and the member for Mayo has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health. In the past, cuts threatened the Child Dental Benefit Schedule, a program which provides $1,000 of free basic dental care for low-income families, because the government claimed the program was underutilised. In March 2016, a review of the program made 4 recommendations to increase uptake, including targeted promotion, making letters more recognisable as a dental voucher and providing follow-up notification to families. Would the minister advise which of these recommendations have been implemented in the 15 months since the review?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Mayo. Let me be absolutely clear. We made a decision, one of the first decisions after the Prime Minister gave me the opportunity to be in this role, to lift the Child Dental Benefit Scheme. This side of Parliament lifted the Child Dental Benefit Scheme from $700 to $1,000. That was a decision which the Prime Minister took, with which we were able to work with him and others, with the Finance Minister and the Treasurer. It injected a significant amount, as was recorded in the budget figures only a month ago, of $160 million over the forward estimates, $160 million to the Child Dental Benefit Scheme. So it couldn't have been a stronger commitment, it couldn't have been a clearer commitment, and it couldn't have been a better funded commitment. So this is an important thing. More than that, we have also been in contact in writing to families throughout Australia. There couldn't be a stronger statement. In addition to that, we have worked through the Australian Dental Association in spreading the message and through dental practices. So when you look at all of the different things we've done, we've added $160 million. We have lifted the Child Dental Benefit Scheme from $700 to $1,000. And let me say this, the Labor Party are the last people to talk. They ripped $1 billion out of dental benefits by abolishing the chronic dental scheme. They abolished the chronic dental scheme, care for those Australians with chronic dental conditions. What a bunch of policy frauds. What a bunch of heartless folk on that side. They rip $1 billion out of the chronic dental scheme, and then they look biased.
Minister will resume his seat for a second. The minister's indicated he's concluded his answer. Just before I call the next question, members could cease interjecting. Please, the member for Grain that could just resume his seat. I'd just like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon Joy Birch, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly for the ACT, together with Mr Tom Duncan, the Clerk of the Legislative Assembly. On behalf of the House, we extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for Fisher.
My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the minister update the House on the steps the government is taking to strengthen the integrity of Australian citizenship, and is he aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. I thank all of my colleagues on this side of the House who are absolutely determined to make sure that we get the settings right when it comes to Australian citizenship. Now, Mr Speaker, now more than ever, we need to make sure that we are accepting the right people as Australian citizens. And since 1949, we've accepted 5 million people to become Australian citizens. They have done a great job in working hard, taking the opportunity afforded them, educating their children, amassing wealth and becoming a great part of the modern Australia. But we want to make sure, Mr Speaker, that the small minority of people who do the wrong thing do not become Australian citizens, which is why it's odd to follow the Leader of the Opposition and those on his front bench and back bench and their contributions to this debate in opposing our changes to strengthen Australian citizenship. Now, this is quite odd, Mr Speaker.
On my left.
It's quite odd. I think they protest a little bit too much, Mr Speaker.
The Minister will resume his seat for a second. The member for Isaacs is now warned. The Minister has the call. The member for Wakefield will leave under 94A.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Thank you very
Member
much,
for
Mr.
Wakefield
Speaker.
will leave under 94A.
Lift the IQ of the place. Well done, Mr. Speaker. It's a great outcome. Thank you. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would say
the Minister will resume his seat. Members on my left, the member for Morton, I'll hear his point of order. He's also warned, by the way, but the member for Morton may proceed. It was for that bellowing about 5 minutes ago, but I'm always happy to hear my friend from the gym, the member for Morton. Yep.
Speaker, that
On
comment
a point
to
of
the,
order?
The point of order is unparliamentary behaviour on the part of the minister. That slur against the member for Wakefield should be withdrawn.
Well, I'll say to all members, if members can stop interjecting for a second, I say to all members, the member for McEwen is not assisting. I say to members, if they wish me to hear these things, they shouldn't carry on like a soccer crowd. I didn't hear what the minister said. I'm finding it very difficult to hear what the minister said. The minister has the call.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I say, it doesn't matter who you look at in the opposition front bench, back bench. They are completely and utterly divided when it comes to what is a very important issue. Now, you had one of the front benches. You had one of the front benches from the Labor Party out in the press today, Mr. Speaker, on this very issue. And as it turns out, some of the measures that he was talking about have already been before this parliament in 2014. He claimed that he hadn't had a briefing or had no understanding or no comprehension of what was being put forward. He dealt with some of these matters only a couple of years ago, Mr. Speaker. But would you trust, Mr. Speaker, I say to members in this place, would you trust anything that comes from the member for Watson when it comes to national security issues? No. You know why, Mr. Speaker? Because his actions speak louder than his words. Because there was a time when he was the immigration minister. They were not glory days, Mr. Speaker. They weren't the best days of the Rudd-Gillard years, Mr. Speaker, because what happened during that period of time, and he wasn't the worst, to be fair, he wasn't the worst among them. We can go to others, including the member for McMahon, but we do know that during the member for Watson's watch, there were 83 boat arrivals, 83 on his watch. He nods approvingly, proud of the fact, 83, not bad compared to double that number, in fact 400 for the member for McMahon. He's very quiet in this debate. So when you have a look, Mr. Speaker, there were 6,600 people came during the member for Watson's watch when he was immigration minister. So if you don't mind, Mr. Speaker, I won't be taking advice from him. The minister's time has concluded.
The member for Goldstein, the member for Rice. Members on my right. The Deputy Prime Minister and the Leader of the House won't conduct a conversation with me. I'm telling you, you won't. The member for Grayndler has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that under the so-called National Rail Program, not a single dollar is available in this entire term of Parliament? Nothing this year, nothing next year and nothing the year after that. Isn't the National Rail Program, in fact, the new NAIF, the No Actual Infrastructure Fund?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question, and I am honoured to be asked a question by him. I don't know how he managed to break through the tactics meeting this morning and get a Guernsey, but and of course we reflect on the fact that he's laid claim to every piece of infrastructure in Australia and beyond, including the pyramids and the Appian Way. Mr. Speaker, my government is investing a record $75 billion over the next decade for roads, rail and airports. We're getting on with the job. We're committed to providing the infrastructure, the sinews for the economy, for the 21st century economy. that Australia needs. But, Mr Speaker, we find there are major projects that the Labor Party is opposing or seeking to frustrate, not least of which is the Inland Rail. Now, the Inland Rail has been around for a long time as an idea, Mr Speaker. It was discussed during the Federal Convention debates in the 1890s.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Grayndler on a point of order. Deputy Prime Minister will cease interjecting. The member for Grayndler on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. It was a very specific question about the National Rail Program. The National Rail Program, which has $0 this year, $0 next year, $0 the year after that. Not a single dollar this decade.
Will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm advised by the Minister there is $600 million alone over the forwards in the $10 billion plan, and so that contradicts what the honourable member has said. But the honourable member would be well aware that rail projects of the kind we're talking about take a long time in the planning, and so it's important that the commitment is made well in advance, which it has been, and then that the money will be available as and when it is required. The coalition government is absolutely committed to investing $75 billion in infrastructure, in national infrastructure, over the next decade. And we are getting on with the infrastructure investment right across the board. I mentioned the Inland Rail, which the Labor Party does not seem to have very much passion for, and I've noticed the Queensland Premier wants to sort of hold hostage until there's commitment to the Cross River Rail in Brisbane. So a vital piece of nation-building infrastructure across regional Australia is to be held hostage until there's a commitment to an urban rail project in the middle of Brisbane. It hardly seems to have a commitment to the national interest. But, Mr Speaker, right across the board, whether it is in rail, whether it is in road, $75 billion of commitment over the next decade, and one of the honourable members opposite was speaking before question time about the national broadband network. That absolute train wreck we inherited from the Labor Party. we are connecting more paying customers every 2 weeks than Labor did
the member
in
for
6
Ballarat.
years. So Labor can't lecture us about infrastructure.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. Members on my left and right, the member for Grayndler seeking to table the document.
I am, Mr Speaker, for the benefit of the Prime Minister, page 49 of budget paper number 3, that shows 0, 0, 0.
As the member for Grayndler knows, no, I'm not even going to seek leave because it's part of the papers of the Parliament. I understand your disappointment. The member for McKellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industries. Will the minister outline to the House how the government's investment in defence industry will generate thousands of jobs for hard-working Australians, create a stronger economy and ensure our nation's security? How will New South Wales benefit from the largest military build-up in our peacetime?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I must say, Mr Speaker, I'm so glad that the member for Grayndler got a question, because I was thinking of giving him one of our Dorothy Dixes if he didn't get one very soon, and that would have meant that I missed out on a question, which would have been very disappointing. So I'm glad that the Leader of the Opposition finally relented and gave one of the member for Rankin's questions to the member for Grayndler. But I digress, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for McKellar for his question, Mr Speaker, because I wasn't long ago in his electorate where I was marking the millionth part created for the Collins-class submarine by H.I. Fraser, a manufacturer in his electorate. And not long after that, I went and visited Rockwell Collins in the member for North Sydney's electorate to witness the production of the 100th optical assembly for the Joint Strike Fighter that provides battlefield awareness for Joint Strike Fighter pilots. They joined businesses like Bird and Boats in the member for Lyons electorate, Mr Speaker, who recently won a contract to upgrade the Army's 24 bridge construction propulsion boats, and importantly have recently won a $400 million export contract to provide those same boats to the US Army from his electorate. So, Mr Speaker, also recently the Prime Minister and I launched Northrop Grumman's $50 million Electronic Sustainment Centre of Excellence at what will be the Defence Industry Precinct that the Minister for Urban Infrastructure is helping to build at the Western Sydney Airport, Mr Speaker. All of these projects, whether it's in Lyne or North Sydney or Mackellar or in Western Sydney, and there are many other projects just like it, all of them, Mr Speaker, are using the defence industry budget to drive jobs, to drive investment, to drive high-value jobs in high technology, advanced manufacturing, Mr Speaker, helping to make real our largest military build-up in our peacetime history, Mr Speaker, which of course stands in very stark contrast to what we saw on the Labor side of the House when they were in government and managed to reduce spending on defence to 1.56% of GDP, Mr Speaker. But people are entitled to ask why we do this, Mr Speaker, and the reason is because the defence industry, the capacity for a sovereign capability in defence industry is as much a part of our national security as the work of our armed forces, our men and women in uniform, Mr Speaker. They are a pillar. They are a pillar, Mr Speaker, in the defence of our nation. And as the Prime Minister said today in his statement on national security, the safety of Australians at home and abroad is the #1 priority of any successful, sensible and serious government, and that is what this government is delivering.
The member for Grayndler. The member for Grayndler has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that Brisbane's Cross River Rail project was approved by Infrastructure Australia in 2012, was the subject of a detailed agreement between the federal and Queensland governments in 2013 and funded in the 2013 budget? Why is the Prime Minister purporting to support public transport in our cities while pretending this essential project is not ready to go?
The member for Perth will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Cross River Rail project is being considered by Infrastructure Australia now, and it is that the honourable member is mistaken. I'm afraid, Mr Speaker. It is being considered by Infrastructure Australia now, and we are awaiting IA's assessment of the project. And I'll ask the Minister for Urban Infrastructure to add to that answer.
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure has the call.
Well, thank you, Prime Minister, and I do thank the Shadow Minister for his question. Let me start by clearing up an inaccuracy in the previous information he provided to the Parliament. Page 133 contains the allocation of $600 million for the Infrastructure Investment Program. Page 133 in the budget papers. It is disappointing to see these kinds of misleading statements being made. Now, I'm asked about Cross River Rail. I note that the Queensland Coordinator General's report on Cross River Rail contains half a page describing the differences between the version that was approved in 2012 and the version that has now been lodged. That's the Queensland Coordinator General's report. This is not the same project. It has changed materially, and what is important is that we have a proper process, for assessing this business case. That is the process that we are working through with Infrastructure Australia. Infrastructure Australia, a body set up indeed by the Shadow Minister when he was the Minister, and this government is committed to a proper allocation of taxpayers' funds and properly and carefully assessing projects before there is a commitment of Commonwealth funding. That is a proper process. We've already committed $10 million for planning, and there's a careful and thorough process underway. So it's very important, Mr Speaker, that the Parliament be provided with the facts rather than a series of regrettably misleading statements.
The member for Bowman.
Speaker, my question to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the government is ensuring that the National Innovation and Science agenda helps drive investment and jobs for hard-working Australians.
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bowman for his question, because he is, like all members of this side of the House, absolutely committed to implementing the National Economic Plan, Mr Speaker, that we outlined again in this year's budget and the previous year's budget, which included, amongst many things, not just the defence industry plan that the Defence Industry Minister has just been outlining to the Parliament again today, expanding the trade frontiers, as this government has done since it was first elected, making sure we put in place our $75 billion infrastructure plan over the next 10 years, and, of course, Mr Speaker, ensuring that our tax system for companies is competitive around the world and that we don't export jobs and investment offshore. But I'm pleased to report today some good results as a result of the work being done by the National Innovation and Science agenda, which members will recall included putting in place tax incentives for angel investors, a 20% tax offset and a 10% capital gains tax discount for investment in those new start-up companies of 12 months or more, and a 10% offset for the early-stage venture capital limited partnerships. Now, today, a report will be launched by the Minister for Industry, Innovation and Science by the Australian Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. And in that report, they will highlight that over the last 12 months, our venture capital markets raised around $1 billion, Mr Speaker, including sizeable investments by institutional investors. Now, on top of that, Australian venture capital funds raised a record $568 million last financial year, and venture capital firms invested $347 million. That is up 50%, Mr Speaker, up 50% on the previous year. Now, this is part of our national plan to drive the jobs that are needed in our economy to support the wages and the wages growth that is needed to support Australian households. And today, Fran Kelly, on the morning program, Mr Speaker, had Mr El Ansari, who was the head of that organisation, on her program. And she said, "The report you're releasing into the impact of venture capital on the economy is good news," she said. "It shows strong growth in venture capital. Is that linked to the Prime Minister's innovation statement?" she asked. He responded, "It is. And in fact, more than that, Fran, it's linked to jobs and growth, to put it simply. It's linked to jobs and growth because funding the future of the Australian economy is really what venture capital is all about. It's funding great businesses that are new to market, doing novel things." He went on to say that a pipeline of dynamic start-ups emerging and more funding entering the market, there is a huge potential for Australian venture capital to back the next Apple or Cochlear. Mr Speaker, the Turnbull government's plan to drive our economy forward is being implemented and it's getting results.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On Friday, for the first time in Australia's history, gross debt will crash through $500 billion. With debt at record highs under this government, how can the country possibly afford to give millionaires a tax cut in 18 days?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. The honourable member is the leader who went to the last election with a policy that involved $16.5 billion of more debt, and indeed involved higher taxes. More debt, higher taxes. That was their policy, and of course they didn't want to give any tax cuts to business, even though they understand, or used to, before he did his backflip, one of many. He is adept at that, Mr Speaker, I'll give you that. He is a backflipper of Olympic proportions. And Mr Speaker, he used to believe that cutting company taxes and business taxes would deliver more investment, more productivity and higher employment. Now, that is not an original insight. I have to give him that. That is standard, common-sense, conventional economics. That's what he used to say. And however, he's backflipped on that and he opposes it. So he says you can't give tax cuts to business. He wants to roll back the tax cuts to small and medium businesses that have already been passed by this parliament. And what is that going to do for jobs? Does he really think that making small and medium businesses, which employ half of the Australians in the private sector workforce, is that going to make them employ more people?
No, Mr Speaker, it will not. It will be putting, just as we have given them this incentive to employ and invest, he wants to put the handbrake on. But the money he claims he saved from that, not having those tax cuts, he's already spent. He'd spent that and was still $16.5 billion more in the red. Now, of course, Mr Speaker, this is the same Leader of the Opposition who in previous times used to boast about the great surpluses that the member for Lilley had achieved. He sent out a newsletter in 2012 claiming the credit for the great economic management of the Labor Party. Mr Speaker, he did that, and of course we've seen that with the member for Rankin at the lead member for Lilley's side in those days. There they were, claiming surpluses that never existed. Mr Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition was fair dinkum for 1 minute, he would recognise that it is the government's plan that will deliver us a surplus. It will deliver us the investment and the incentives for business. It will deliver us the growth that we need. There is not one element, not one element in the Labor Party's policy which would encourage one business to invest, one business to employ a person. Nothing. All they have is a recipe for higher taxes, and yet they still want to run up more debt. Whether it was in government or in opposition, the Labor Party is the party of low growth and high debt.
The member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the minister update the House on the benefits the rollout of the National Disability Insurance Scheme will bring to people with disability, their families and carers? How will these reforms be fully funded, and are there any alternatives?
The Minister for Social Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question, because, as the member is so very well aware, when the NDIS is fully operational, it is going to provide coverage to each and every Australian, all of our own families, whether or not you have acquired a disability through the course of your life or whether or not you are born with a disability. And one example that was briefed to me earlier was an example of a 40-year-old participant who may have suffered a brain injury due to a physical assault at an earlier age where insurance support was not available. And if that person enters the NDIS at age 40 and has 30 years inside the NDIS, the estimate is that they will be supported to the amount of about $110,000 a year. So that's $3.3 million in care, in support, and that is available to each and every Australian, to our families, should we need it. That is why we say that, given everyone benefits, that it's fair that everyone within a reasonable capacity to pay is able to pay a little bit. And I'm asked, Mr Speaker, about alternatives by the honourable member. And that is a slightly tricky question, because there have been so many alternatives from members opposite that it's actually hard to keep count. I've got 6 so far and counting, and the 6 comes from the Shadow Treasurer, and it's probably the most recent and bizarre. But Alternative 1, Labor says they did not leave a funding gap, so no problem, nothing to see here. Alternative 2, Labor says that the funding gap that they say doesn't actually exist does actually need to be filled, but just not by the mechanism that they used to say was the only fair way to fund the NDIS. Alternative 3, all of Labor in 2013 said that the 0.5% increase in the Medicare levy was the fair way to fund the NDIS. Alternative 4 is that in 2017 75% of the Shadow Cabinet say it's still the fairest way to fund the NDIS. Alternative 5 is that the notable exception to the 75% is the Leader of the Opposition, who said in 2013 it was completely dumb to oppose the 0.5% increase, and now says it's completely dumb to support the 0.5% increase. And that brings us, with a minute to go, Mr Speaker, to Alternative 6. Some theoretical physicists believe in multiverses, infinite universes in space-time, matter and energy and public policy. And maybe the proof is here with us, because we have the Shadow Treasurer. The Shadow Treasurer, when asked a direct question on the Medicare levy, he slipped up on radio because he actually said what he really thought. He thought that we should accept the Medicare levy but just not use it to fund the NDIS. This is what he said. The changes before us, the proposals before us, are that every Australian over an income of $21,000 should have a tax rise. Now we accept the need for that. That's right. The Shadow Treasurer said, we accept the need for that, we just don't accept the rationale of the NDIS link. So alternative Universe 6 is they want the Medicare levy increase, but not...
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that wholesale electricity prices have more than doubled under his government?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the honourable member, I can't give the honourable member confirmation about the exact percentage, but there is no doubt that wholesale electricity prices have considerably increased in very recent times. There's no doubt about that, and the major cause of that has been the increase in the price of gas. And the price of gas, wholesale price of gas, has risen dramatically. Now that has been in large part because of the policy decisions taken by state governments, in particular the state government of Victoria, which has banned the exploration and development of gas. We are taking decisive action to ensure, including the potential restriction on exports of gas, very stern measures to ensure that the East Coast domestic gas market is fully supplied. We are taking those actions to do that, and that is our response to ensure that we bring gas prices down. And as I said earlier in response to a question, I think, from the member for Port Adelaide, of the measures already announced have had a response. But in the time available, I'll ask the Minister to add to my answer.
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the Prime Minister's right. The Prime Minister's right. Wholesale prices have gone up. But, you know, they're only a third of the bill. And when you look at the total bill under the Labor Party, you know what happened? It doubled, Mr Speaker. It doubled. It went up over 100%. Do you remember the cash for clunkers? Yes. Do you remember pink bats? Yes. Do you remember the Citizens' Assembly? Yes. Do you remember the greatest moral challenge of our time, Mr Speaker? They were the policies that you delivered. They were the policies that you delivered. And now it's Labor governments in the Northern Territory who are sitting on 180 years worth of reserves of gas. It's the Andrews government of Victoria that is sitting on 40 years' worth of the reserves of gas, and are not only putting restrictions on unconventional gas extraction, but also on conventional gas extraction onshore. So if you want to get electricity prices down, pick up the phone to Spring Street, ring Dan the man and say, lift your moratoriums and bans. Say, lift your moratoriums and bans. Don't always blame someone else. Ring up the Northern Territory. Don't want to ring up the Northern Territory. No, I tell you what, Bill. I tell you what, Leader of the Opposition. I tell you your 45% emissions reduction target has been described as reckless and risky. Your 50% renewable energy target is like that too, Mr Speaker. Only we can be trusted with electricity prices.
The Leader of the Opposition seeking the call.
Oh, certainly.
Yep. The member for Canning.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy, representing the Minister for Education and Training. Will the Minister inform the House how the government's need-based funding model will provide funding growth for schools in my electorate of Canning? And is the Minister aware of expert support for the Australian Education Amendment Bill?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy, representing the Minister for Education.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Canning.
The member for Bruce will leave under 94A.
And acknowledge his deep commitment to the Turnbull government's extra funding for schools throughout his own electorate and across the country. $18.6 billion in additional funding, a 75% increase. 9,000 plus schools will benefit. And in the seat of Canning, there are 23,000 school students in 53 different schools, Mr Speaker. And as a result of the Turnbull government's plan, there will be $1.5 billion worth of school funding for those schools in the electorate of Canning. 37 government schools, 9 independent schools and 7 Catholic schools, Mr Speaker. Like Pinjarra Primary School, with 620 students, which will get a $6.2 million increase.
like St Joseph's Primary School, Mr Speaker, with 130 students, which will get a $3.6 million increase. And across Western Australia, under one of the Labor's 27 secret dodgy deals, the students of Western Australia got the worst possible deal across Australia when it came to the school resource standard. They only got 14%. 14%! And under the Turnbull government, they'll get 20%, Mr Speaker. 20%. No wonder the Turnbull government's plan has been welcomed by the Grattan Institute. No wonder it's been welcomed by the State Schools Association. No wonder it's been welcomed by the Christian Schools Association. No wonder it's been welcomed by the Brisbane Catholic Education Office, Mr Speaker. Now I'm asked, are there any other particular views of note? And today, Dr Ken Boston, one of the original members of the Gonski panel, a former head of New South Wales and South Australia's education departments, this is what he had to say. There are no grounds for opposition to the school's funding bill in principle, and every reason to work collaboratively towards its successful implementation and further refinement in the years ahead. It will be a tragedy if the school funding bill is voted down in the Senate, Mr Speaker. So ultimately, it's up to the Leader of the Opposition. He's standing alone in opposition to an additional $18.6 billion in funding. He's showing why his former dictum, his famous line, "If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there," is starting to work, Mr Speaker, because he doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't know where he's going. If he was supportive of more school student funding, if he was in favour of a more transparent, fairer system, he would get behind the Turnbull government's education plan with an extra $18.6 billion for more than 9,000 schools across the country.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that in just 18 days' time, on the 1st of July, AGL power prices in New South Wales will go up by 16%, penalty rates will be cut for nearly 700,000 Australians, and millionaires will get a tax cut? When household budgets for low and middle-income Australians are getting even tighter, why is the Prime Minister's only priority giving people who earn $1 million a tax cut?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I think it's clear that the Leader of the Opposition's only priority is try to whip up, in his characteristically feeble manner, a politics of envy campaign. That's what he tries to do, posing yet again as the champion of the poor and oppressed, bleating about millionaires in Canberra sucking up to them in Melbourne. We all know his fall. He sold out the members of the AWU again and again. There wasn't a big company that he wasn't prepared to cut a deal with to sell out their penalty rates. He did it with Clean Event, he did it with Chiquita Mushroom and so many others. The workers, the members of his union, know that. He can turn his back on the government benches, but he can't turn his back on his past. A serial sellout, a man who has backflipped and backed and filled, temporised at every turn. There is no consistency in his political lines or his lines as an industrial leader, constantly letting down his own team. Now he talks about tax. He's opposing tax cuts for Australian businesses. He wants to roll back. Remember rollback? That was another Labor leader was keen on that. He wants to roll back the tax cuts that have already been delivered to Australian small and medium businesses, which employ half the Australian workforce, Mr Speaker. And yet, only a few years ago, he stood right where I am standing and said, "We all know," he said, "we all know," with the air of a man who spent his life learning about economics. "We all know," said the great economist, the Leader of the Opposition, "we all know that reducing company tax increases investment, productivity and employment, and the benefits go to workers." He said all that. Well, someone had put that in his talking points, you know what, Mr Speaker, and they were correct. That was absolutely orthodox economic analysis. But now it suits him to campaign against tax cuts to business. He wants to pretend that the deficit levy is being abolished. It's not being abolished, Mr Speaker. It is expiring. It is expiring in exactly the terms
on the terms that the Labor Party voted for. This was a tax increase 3 years ago, which the Labor Party described as a deceit tax. They condemned it. The member for McMahon was particularly eloquent. He said the Labor Party does not agree with increasing the top marginal rate. He said it was bad policy, but then reluctantly they voted for it, but on the express condition that it expired after 3 years. Mr Speaker, the deficit levy is expiring in precisely the terms Labor voted for. This is just another example of his backflips and his hypocrisy.
The member for Capricornia.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House steps the government is taking to support employment in the agriculture sector in Queensland? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any threats to existing and future jobs in regional Australia, particularly in my electorate of Capricornia?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question and have been, whilst question time's been on, listening quite closely to the Queensland budget and exactly what's going on up there. And as far as Central Queensland's going, as far as the Queensland Labor Party's budget's going, well, nothing's going to happen for Central Queensland. It was hopeless, pathetic. We have given them a project. We put $130 million on the table for it, put $2 million on the table for it for the business case. And what do they give? Nothing. So I thought they might have something in there for Hell's Gap. No, there's nothing there for Hell's Gap. They might have had something in there for Nathan. There's nothing there for Nathan. They might have had something there for Emu Swamp down at Stanthorpe, but there's nothing there. They might have had something for Urana, but there's nothing there. They might have something, but you thought they would have had something for Rookwood. At the very least, you think they'd have something for Rookwood, something in which would underpin the fact that we know that there's more water being required from that project than we actually have. It's oversubscribed. We know that it's got an incredible return. We hear that it's around about 3. There's return for it on its equity. So, but what we did here in the budget in Queensland is a lot about the Cross River Rail. Because there's always a budget in the Labor Party. It's a budget for inner suburban Brisbane. That's what it was. A budget for inner suburban Brisbane. And so it's amazing. It's amazing how the Labor Party, shadow Minister for Infrastructure, the member for Grainler, got a chance today to come to the dispatch box and say that he supported the Inland Rail, to say that they actually had money on the table for Inland Rail. But not only will they not let him have a question except once every 6 months or so, he doesn't either have money for Inland Rail. No money for Inland Rail from the Labor Party. No money for Rookwood from the Labor Party. They don't have a belief. They don't have a belief in the working men and women of Central Queensland anymore. They've given up on the working men and women of Central Queensland. They've given up on the coal miners at Carmichael. They've given up on the steel workers at Whyalla, and they've given up on Central Queensland. The Queensland Labor Party today, in the budget they just drew down, had a chance to show once more of their belief in Central Queensland, and once more they have shown themselves completely lacking. So we can say to the member for Flynn that if the Labor Party is going to look after Central Queensland, mate, you've got no worries, because the Labor Party is doing nothing for Central Queensland. I say that to the member for Flynn. I say to the member for Capricornia, if you're worried about the Labor Party coming in and showering Rockhampton with gifts, we don't have to worry about it, because they're doing nothing. They're doing nothing. They never did Rookwood Weir. I say to all the members in Central Queensland, it's a shame. It's a shame that the Labor Party has lost sight of labourers. They have lost sight of water infrastructure. They have lost sight of the Inland Rail. They have no vision for Queensland. They have no vision for Australia. They have no vision except for the Cross River Rail.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the emissions intensity threshold under a clean energy target be at, higher or lower than 0.6 tonnes?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Well, the member for Port Adelaide should know very well why we commissioned, through the COAG Energy Council, the report from the Chief Scientist. Because in South Australia, the big experiment went wrong. And the member for Port Adelaide described it as a hiccup, and 1.7 million people lost power. So we have from the Chief Scientist a detailed report more than 200 pages in length with a series of recommendations from an expert panel. And we have said publicly we will give his report the due consideration that it deserves. We will give it the due consideration that it deserves because there are a whole series of recommendations. A clean energy target, which the Leader of the Opposition should know was the preferred recommendation over his emissions intensity scheme, Mr Speaker. And why? Because his emissions intensity scheme was punishing coal, Mr Speaker. And the member for Shorten opens his mouth.
The member for Shorten will cease interjecting.
Has he told them
the member for
that there'll be
Shorten.
hundreds of people in his own electorate who lose their jobs as a result of his own policy, Mr Speaker? And as the member for Hunter opened his mouth, no, he's looking at his phone because he knows that hundreds of people in his electorate will lose their jobs.
And Energy will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's on direct relevance. You don't get a question more specific than this. It refers to the emissions intensity threshold and asks whether the target will be higher or lower than 0.6 tonnes. There is no preamble, no rhetoric attached, and the answer has to be directly relevant.
In addressing the Manager of Opposition Business's point of order, as he knows, I allow ministers to have a preamble. The minister is now nearing halfway through the question. The Manager of Opposition Business is right to point out it was a very specific question, and the minister needs to either address himself to the specifics of the question or wind his answer up.
There is a very specific answer, Mr Speaker, which is the clean energy target was one of the recommendations out of the Finkel review, and we will give it due consideration. Absolutely. Okay. So, will the Leader of the Opposition come to the dispatch box, dump his emissions intensity scheme, front up to the member for Hunter and tell him he's sold out to hundreds of workers, stand up to the member for Shortland and tell him that he's going to lead to hundreds of jobs there. We will give this report its due consideration, Mr Speaker. But there are a series of important recommendations in the Finkel review. The clean energy target is one, but I do note that there is a broad chorus of support.
The Manager of Opposition Business. Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order other than relevance.
Yeah, other than relevance, simply on the minister defying the ruling that you gave. If he has given an answer quite specific, where he said that they will continue to consider the matter, and then he's acknowledged, well, in the remaining time he'll talk about other things. It's a time limit, not a time target, and he doesn't have to make 3 minutes.
The Manager of Opposition Business is correct at one level. It is a limit, not a target, and I've made that point myself. But having raised the point of order and the minister having directly addressed the point of the question, which is acknowledged, it doesn't then mean that the person asking the question gets to eliminate the 3 minutes. The requirement is that he is on the policy topic. He's answered the question as the Manager of Opposition Business has noted, and there's 50 seconds to go. He won't stray onto any other policy topics. If he needs the next 50 seconds, he's got them.
Look, Mr Speaker, the energy issue is an absolutely vital economic issue and environmental issue for the future of our country. The Prime Minister has outlined the trilemma that we're seeking to solve, and our focus is on the engineering and the economics. The Labor Party is focused on ideology, reckless targets and costing jobs, and we won't trade out the hundreds of thousands of people whose jobs rely across the country on affordable and stable power. That is the Coalition's objective, and as far as the Finkel review, it provides a lot of food for thought.
The member for Ford has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure. Will the minister update the House on the government's record $75 billion infrastructure investment program? And how is this investment delivering major projects right across the country, including in my state of Queensland? And are there any alternatives?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for Ford, who is of course a very strong champion of infrastructure for Queensland and for his electorate of Ford. Indeed, it was just recently that there was an announcement of a $500 million package comprising the Mudgee-Bar to Varsity Lakes section of the M1 being widened, a major upgrade of the M1 at the Gateway motorway merge point at the 8 Mile Plains, a major upgrade of Walkerston Bypass near Mackay, the widening of the Mount Lindesay Highway, and the member for Ford was central to the advocacy for that, as were the members for McPherson, for Moncrief, for Fadden, for Wright, for Dawson, for Capricornia. A team effort for Queensland, the Turnbull government delivering for Queensland, as we are continuing to do. The facts, Mr Speaker, are these. In this budget there is a commitment of $7.65 billion between 2017-18 and 2020-21. Indeed, just in 2017-18, $2.1 billion. Let's focus on the Bruce Highway for a moment, Mr Speaker. Always a topic of great interest to the Queensland team in the Turnbull government. $844 million for new upgrades to the Bruce Highway in this budget, and I commend the work of my friend, the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, in delivering this. $530 million for Pyne River to Caloundra, $120 million for an upgrade to the Deception Bay interchange. And Mr Speaker, Deception Bay is a very appropriate point to turn to the Shadow Minister's approach to the question of infrastructure, because he claims incorrectly that there's been a cut in infrastructure spending. In fact, the average numbers 2013-14 to 2020-21, $8 billion. Under the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government, $6 billion. What's the difference? He's just tried to assume away equity investment. Now I'm asked are there alternative approaches. It turns out there are actually two alternative approaches, and they're both on that side of the chamber, because the Shadow Minister claims that we're cutting infrastructure investment because he deliberately ignores billions of dollars in equity investments. The Leader of the Opposition in his recent CETA speech had this to say, quotes, "We need a new approach to infrastructure, clearing the way for super funds and others to invest in good projects." So it seems the Shadow Minister says grants are good and equity is bad. It seems the Opposition Leader says grants are good and equity is better. We've seen this kind of Orwellian approach before, but it takes a special kind of talent to bring this doctrinaire Orwellianism to infrastructure, but this lot unfortunately has it.
The Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
I thank the Prime Minister.